The rain fell in sheets that afternoon, the kind of cold, relentless rain that soaks through wool and settles in a bone. Elara Vassenhale stood at the edge of two freshly dug graves, her black dress plastered to her arms, her umbrella doing almost nothing against the wind. Around her, maybe 200 people had gathered, old family friends, industry veterans, former colleagues of her parents, people who had loved Leonard and Seraphine Vossen the way you love institutions, the way you love landmarks you assume will always be standing. She hadn't cried yet, not because she didn't feel it, but because the grief was so large it had nowhere to go. It sat in her chest like concrete, heavy and cold and immovable. The priest was still speaking when she heard it. The sound of car doors. Multiple doors, expensive hinges, the particular thud of luxury vehicles. She didn't turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the mahogany caskets, on the flowers, white lilies, her mother's favorite, on the ropes being slowly lowered by men in dark gloves. She heard the footsteps coming through the wet grass. She heard the murmur ripple through the crowd, that particular human sound of collective discomfort when something is happening that shouldn't be. And then Damien was standing beside her. Elara turned to look at her husband of 9 years, and in the single second before she registered what was in his hand, she felt something almost like relief. He had come. Despite everything that had been wrong between them for the last 2 years, despite the distance and the silence and the excuses, he had come to stand with her while she buried her parents. That relief lasted exactly 1 second, because standing 3 feet behind Damien, holding a black umbrella and wearing a charcoal coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was Celeste Wynn. The crowd went absolutely still. Damien held out an envelope. White, sealed, legal-sized. He held it the way you hand someone a receipt, matter-of-factly, without ceremony, the way you might pass a document across a desk. And he said, in a voice that didn't lower itself even slightly, "These are divorce papers. I had them drawn up last week. I think today is as good a time as any." Elara looked at the envelope. She looked at Celeste, who had arranged her face into an expression that was trying very hard not to be a smirk and failing. She looked back at Damien, at his jaw, at the set of his shoulders, at the absolute absence of hesitation in his eyes, and she understood, with a clarity that only comes from shock, that he had planned this. He had chosen this moment deliberately. Her parents' funeral, in front of everyone who had ever known them. He wanted her humiliated. He wanted her diminished. He wanted the last image the world had of Elara Vassenhale to be a woman receiving divorce papers over an open grave. "Your parents," Damien said, and his voice was almost bored, "were the only reason I stayed." Someone in the crowd made a sound, a sharp intake of breath. An elderly woman near the back said something quietly in French. The priest had stopped speaking entirely. Elara took the envelope. She opened it. She read the first page, the second, skimmed the third. Her hand was steady. Her face was composed. She reached into her bag, the small black clutch she'd carried to every funeral she'd ever attended, and she found a pen. She uncapped it. She signed on every line that required her signature, and when she was done, she folded the papers back into the envelope and handed it to Damien without a single word. He blinked. He had expected something. Tears, maybe. Pleading. A scene. Something he could walk away from feeling superior about. He got nothing. She turned back to her parents' graves, and she watched the caskets finish their descent, and she stood there in the rain until every single person had left, including Damien, including Celeste, including the priest, including the gravediggers. She stood there until the only sound was rain and wind and the distant traffic of a city that didn't know or care that the two most important people in her life were now on the ground. Then she knelt, right there in the wet grass, in her funeral dress, and she pressed both palms flat against the earth above her father's grave. "I know," she said quietly. "I know exactly what I'm going to do." She had always known. She had just been waiting for the right moment. To understand what Damien Hale threw away that afternoon, you have to go back. You have to go back 14 years to a film festival in Vienna where a 21-year-old Elara Vossen sat in the third row of a small screening room and watched a 40-minute short film that was rough and overlong and badly lit in places, but contained, in its center, something extraordinary. A vision. A real one. The kind you don't encounter often. After the screening, she found the filmmaker sitting outside on the festival steps, eating a sandwich from a paper bag, wearing a jacket with a broken zipper. His name was Damien Hale. He was 26. He had spent his last available funds getting to Vienna. He had no plan for getting home. "Your ending doesn't work," she told him, sitting down beside him. He looked at her. "Excuse me." The final scene. The confrontation between the brothers. "It's too on the nose. You spelled out everything the film had already shown us. You don't trust your audience." Damien stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Who are you?" "Someone who just watched your film," she said. "Do you want notes or not?" He wanted notes. They talked for 4 hours on those steps. Then they had dinner. Then they talked until 2 in the morning. And by the time they said goodnight, something had shifted between them that neither of them had a name for yet. What Elara felt was recognition. The specific, rare recognition of encountering a mind that operates at a frequency close to your own. What she didn't tell him, not that night, not for a long time afterward, was that her last name was Vossen, that her parents were Leonard and Seraphine Vossen, that the company quietly financing 3 of the most important independent film distribution deals in Europe that year was a subsidiary of a holding group that her family controlled, that the world Damien was trying to break into was, in many meaningful ways, a world that Elara's family had built. She didn't tell him because she was 21 and she was tired of people looking at her differently the moment they learned her last name. She didn't tell him because she wanted to know who he was before he knew who she was. And she didn't tell him because something in her sensed, with the particular intuition she had inherited from her mother, that this information, shared too soon, would change the dynamic between them in ways that could not be undone. So she let him fall in love with her first. And she fell in love with him genuinely, completely, the way you fall in love when you're 21 and you have never been in love before and you believe with your whole heart that this person sees you. They married 4 years later. A small ceremony, her parents' estate in the countryside, 40 guests, wildflowers, late summer light. Leonard Vossen shook Damien's hand at the reception and said, "Take care of my daughter." And Damien said, "I will." And he meant it then. Elara believed he meant it. She believed it for longer than she should have. In those early years, she supported him quietly. That was her way. She was not the kind of person who needed credit. She found the scripts that deserve attention. She read them overnight and left notes on his desk in the morning. She identified the emerging directors before anyone else was watching. She made calls, carefully worded calls, always positioned as personal interest rather than leverage, to people in the industry who could open the right doors. She never told Damien who she was calling or why those calls produced results. And because Damien was the kind of person who needed to believe in his own genius, he accepted the results without asking too many questions about the mechanism. Her parents provided financing twice in those first 5 years. Structured carefully, routed through intermediary production agreements, nothing that bore the Vossen name on the surface. A bridge loan for his second feature when the primary investor pulled out at the last moment. A distribution guarantee for his third film that got it into 11 international markets. Neither time did Damien know where the money came from. And Elara did not tell him, because by then she had begun to understand something important about her husband. The story he told himself about his own success was the thing he protected above everything else. More than her, more than their marriage, more than truth. She told herself it didn't matter. That what mattered was the work, the life they were building, the love she still believed was real underneath the ego and the ambition. She told herself this for years. She kept telling herself this right up until the point when it became impossible to believe. The night Damien came home and told her he was attaching his name as sole creator to a project called The Ivory Throne, Elara was in the kitchen. She was making tea. It was 11 at night, and she'd been working since 6 in the morning, and she was tired, genuinely tired, the kind of fatigue that comes from caring about too many things for too long. She listened to him talk about the project. She asked careful questions, and she noticed, the way she always noticed things that Damien assumed she wouldn't, that he was vague about the screenplay's origin. He said it had come to him. He said it was something he'd been developing. He said the story had been evolving in his mind for years. She didn't push. She poured her tea, and she said the project sounded compelling, and she went upstairs. But she made a note. Elara Vassenhale made notes about everything. 3 weeks later, she was in the offices of a small studio on the 14th floor of a building downtown, going through a backlog of unsolicited submissions for a different purpose entirely, when a name caught her eye. Micah Vale, 23 years old, had submitted a screenplay called The Ivory Throne 11 months earlier. She requested the file. She read the submission letter. She read the logline. Then she read the first 20 pages of the script. She sat very still for a long time. Then she made a note. It would be another year before she did anything with that note. Because around that time, her mother's diagnosis came. And then the second diagnosis, her father's, following 6 months later, as though Leonard's body had decided that a world without Seraphine wasn't worth operating in. And for the next 18 months, Elara's world narrowed to hospitals and home nurses and late-night phone calls with specialists and holding her mother's hand through chemotherapy and watching her father, who had been the largest, most vital person she had ever known, become someone who needed help standing up from a chair. Through all of it, Damien was present the way a piece of furniture is present. He was in a room, but he was not there. He attended the obligatory hospital visits. He said the appropriate things. He made the appropriate face. But he was distracted, always half somewhere else. And Elara, who was carrying grief so heavy it had started to affect her sleep, started to notice the particular quality of that distraction. The phone he kept face down. The texts he answered in bathrooms. The evenings that ran long without explanation. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She was busy keeping her parents alive. She was busy holding together everything that was fracturing around her. She filed the information away with the same quiet, methodical precision she applied to everything. And she waited. Her mother died on a Thursday morning in early spring. Peacefully, the doctors said, which is a word that means in her sleep rather than in pain, and which Elara has thought about many times since, because peaceful is not what it felt like from outside. Her father lasted 7 more weeks. He deteriorated rapidly, as people sometimes do when the person they have loved for 40 years is no longer in the world, to give them a reason to maintain the effort. His last real conversation with Elara was 3 days before the end. He held her hand, and he looked at her with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in those last days, and he said, "You know what you are, don't you?" She said, "Tell me." He said, "You are the company. You always have been. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." And then he said the thing she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Silence is a gift, Elara. Never let anyone mistake it for surrender. She held his hand until he fell asleep. She kissed his forehead. She walked out of the hospital room and into the corridor, and she stood with her back against the wall, and she breathed slowly, deliberately, until she was certain she could drive herself home without incident. Then she drove home, and in the quiet of the house she had shared with Damien for 7 years, she opened her laptop, and she began to make a list. Crescent Dominion Studios occupied 12 floors of a building in the center of the city's media district. From the street, it looked like every other glass and steel tower in that neighborhood. Impressive but anonymous, the architecture of institutional power rather than personal ambition. Inside, it was something else entirely. The kind of place where every detail communicated the casual accumulation of decades of influence. The original film posters in the corridor outside the executive suite, the awards lining the atrium walls, the soft hum of a company that touched streaming and film and publishing and gaming and television with the particular confidence of something that has been dominant long enough to forget what competition feels like. Most of the 4,800 employees who worked in that building had some version of the same understanding of Elara. She was in archives, research, possibly, the wife of the producer. She came in sometimes, she was always quiet, she always knew where things were, she never seemed to be in a hurry. She was pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of woman you smile at in the elevator and then forget by the time the doors open. Not one of them knew that she owned the building. Not one of them knew that the trust her parents had established 22 years earlier, structured with the particular legal precision of people who had spent decades protecting what they built, had placed 61% of Crescent Dominion Studios into Elara's name. Not one of them knew that Northbridge Legacy Group, the holding company that controlled Crescent Dominion's parent structure and sat at the top of the entire corporate architecture, was chaired by a woman who spent most of her time in the archives department drinking green tea and going unnoticed. Gideon Ashcroft knew. He had known since Elara was 19 years old, since Leonard had brought him into the family office and sat him down and explained, with characteristic directness, exactly what the succession plan looked like and exactly why the structure had been built the way it had been built. The wrong people will always try to take what they didn't earn, Leonard had told him. Our job is to make sure they can't. Gideon was 57 now and had been the family's CFO and financial guardian for 23 years, and in all that time he had never once seen Elara Vossenhale act rashly. Not once. Not even when there had been more than adequate provocation. He had watched her absorb things that would have broken other people. He had watched her file information away with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that timing is everything. He had called her the day after the funeral, not to offer condolences, though he offered those too, but because there was business to attend to. The trust activation timeline, he said when she answered. I know, she said. I'm ready. 3 days after her parents were buried, Elara sat at the head of a conference table on the 41st floor of the Crescent Dominion building. Beside her sat Gideon Ashcroft and Rowan Mercer, the family attorney, who was 63 years old and had the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human greed and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. On the table between them were documents. A great many documents. The kind of documents that, once signed, rearranged the world. Your parents' trust, Rowan said, setting a thick folder in front of her, is now fully activated. The conditions were both parents deceased with no surviving challenge period outstanding. That condition is now met. Walk me through everything, Elara said. Rowan walked her through everything. The 61% controlling stake in Crescent Dominion. The chairmanship of Northbridge Legacy Group. The voting authority across all subsidiary companies, including the film production arm, the streaming division, the publishing house, the gaming studio, the international television networks. The individual board seats. The executive appointment powers. The contractual override capabilities that her parents had quietly embedded in the governance structure years before anyone had thought to look for them. Elara listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, each of them precise, each of them answered without hesitation. Then she picked up the pen, and she signed. One more thing, Gideon said when the signing was complete. He slid a separate document across the table. Damien's current projects. The one he's about to premiere. She looked at the document. The Ivory Throne. The production budget passed through our film division's financing arm, Gideon said, which means the film's financial infrastructure runs through infrastructure that is now, legally and completely, under your control. Elara set the document down. She looked out the window at the city below, at the particular quality of morning light on glass and steel, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How much time do we have before the premiere? 6 weeks, Rowan said. She nodded. That's enough time. For what? Gideon asked. She picked up her pen again and began making notes. For all of it, she said. What happened in those 6 weeks is the part of this story that most people afterward found hardest to believe. Not because what Elara did was impossible, but because of how she did it. Quietly, methodically, without a single public move that anyone could point to as a sign of what was coming. While Damien attended parties and gave interviews and appeared on magazine covers with Celeste on his arm, while the entertainment press speculated about whether the upcoming premiere of The Ivory Throne would cement his legacy as the defining creative voice of his generation, Elara went to work. She started with the finances. Gideon had already engaged a forensic audit firm, quietly, through a holding entity that bore no obvious connection to Crescent Dominion, 3 weeks before the trust activation. Their initial findings had been preliminary. Now, with Elara's authority fully in place, the scope of the audit expanded dramatically. The first report landed on her desk on a Tuesday morning. She read it in full. Then she read it again. The expenses attached to the Ivory Throne's production account were extensive. They were also creative in the particular way that only someone who believes they will never be audited is creative. There were villa rentals in the south of France, private jet bookings that bore no relationship to any scheduled production location, spa retreats, designer clothing purchases routed through a prop acquisition account, personal assistants billed as production coordinators, a jewelry purchase, $87,000, categorized as costume development. Celeste Wynn's name appeared on multiple expense lines, sometimes under her own name and sometimes under a shell company that had been incorporated 3 months after she and Damien had begun their affair. The forensic team flagged it methodically. Each item tag cross-referenced, documented. By the end of the second week, the total of misappropriated funds from production accounts attached to the Ivory Throne and 2 previous productions ran to just over $4 million. Elara looked at that number for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, he stole from the company, and the company is mine. But the financial fraud was not the part that made her stillest. The part that made her stillest came in week 3, when a young man appeared at Gideon's office and asked, with visible anxiety, whether someone could help him. His name was Micah Vale. He was 27. He was wearing a jacket that had been washed too many times and carrying a backpack that contained, among other things, a printed copy of a screenplay he had written 3 years earlier. He had a submission receipt, dated, time-stamped, bearing the studio's official intake stamp, from when he had submitted the screenplay to a development executive who had since left the company. He had email chains. He had handwritten development notes in his own handwriting that predated the production of The Ivory Throne by 14 months. He had, in other words, a trail of evidence that was remarkably clear. What he didn't have was money for lawyers. What he didn't have was the belief that anyone would listen to him. He had tried to raise the issue 6 months earlier through a junior entertainment attorney and had received a cease and desist letter from Damien's legal team within 10 days. He had gone quiet after that, the way people go quiet when they are 27 and afraid and the person they're up against has resources they cannot imagine. Elara met with him personally, not in the formal boardroom, in a small meeting room on the 14th floor, the kind of room with a round table and a window that looked out onto nothing in particular. She sat across from him, and she let him tell her everything. The whole story, the submission, the silence from the studio, the way he had watched his own work appear, renamed, reframed, with Damien Hale's name in every byline, and it felt the particular, devastating helplessness of a person watching something stolen from them in full public view. At one point his voice broke. He pressed his hands flat on the table, and he said, I know I can't afford to fight this. I know how it looks, but I wrote that screenplay. Every word of it was mine. Elara said, I know. He looked at her. You know, we have your submission record, she said. We have a timestamp. We have the intake documentation. And I've read both scripts. He was quiet. His eyes were red. No one, Elara said, and her voice was very calm, very steady, built this company to protect thieves. Micah Vale made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a word. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, What happens now? Now, Elara said, you let our legal team take over. You give us everything you have. Every email, every draft, every note. And you wait. How long, he asked. 6 weeks, she said. The smear campaign started in week 4. Elara had expected it, though she hadn't known exactly when it would begin or from which direction it would come. Victor Thorne announced it, in his way, with an op-ed in a trade publication. The kind of piece that is too carefully worded to constitute a direct attack, but too specifically targeted to be coincidence. Questioning the competence of unnamed executives at unnamed companies in the aftermath of leadership succession events. The subtext was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read these things. Victor was 60 years old and had been on the Crescent Dominion board for 11 years. He was the kind of board member who had spent the better part of a decade positioning himself as indispensable through the cultivation of relationships with other board members, through the slow accumulation of influence over executive decisions, through making himself the person that institutional investors called when they had questions. He had operated under the assumption, the reasonable, historically supported assumption, that when Leonard Seraphine Vossen passed, the governance vacuum would be significant enough for someone with his connections and his appetite to step into. He had not accounted for Elara. The articles that followed the op-ed were more direct. Not direct enough to be actionable, but direct enough to land. Entertainment blogs picked up a narrative that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, fully formed. That the Vossen heir was an administrative functionary with no business experience. That the company's board was concerned about the succession. That the real creative and commercial engine of the company's most recent success story was, in fact, Damien Hale, whose upcoming film was positioned as the defining achievement of the studio's current era. Elara read every article. She noted the language patterns, the sourcing, the timing of publication, the way the same 3 talking points appeared across outlets that had no obvious connection to each other. She gave these notes to the forensic team with instructions to trace the funding behind the publication campaigns. It took 4 days to find the connection. 3 of the online publications had received advertising commitments in the previous 2 months from a media placement firm that could be traced through a shell structure that was 3 layers deep, but not quite 4, to an account that had been funded by the same production finance mechanism that had been misappropriating funds from Damien's film. Victor Thorne's personal consulting fee, drawn from a separate board advisory account, had processed through the same intermediary bank during the same period. The trap was not one Elara had set. It was one they had built for themselves. She had simply been watching closely enough to see it. Meanwhile, Damien became reckless. This was the thing that, looking back, should not have surprised anyone who had paid attention to how he operated under pressure. He had always been someone who, when threatened, chose escalation over caution. He had always been someone who believed that force of personality and speed of action could outpace any structural disadvantage. He began making calls to senior executives at the company, calls that were recorded by the standard communications protocol that had been in place since Elara's father had upgraded the system 7 years earlier, a security infrastructure that Damien had never paid the slightest attention to because he had never imagined it might matter to him. He pressured a junior finance administrator to reclassify expense entries. That conversation was recorded. He called a post-production supervisor and asked him to delete a specific set of files from the production server. That call was recorded. The deletion attempt was logged by the digital security system, flagged, timestamped, preserved, and the files were recovered from the backup architecture that Gideon's team had quietly reinforced at the start of the audit process. Every move Damien made to cover his tracks was documented in real time. By week 5, Rowan Mercer looked at the total evidence package and said, in his quiet, dry way, "This is the cleanest fraud case I've seen in 30 years of practice." Elara said, "Good. What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She looked at the calendar on the wall. "I want to wait 1 more week," she said. The night of the premiere was the kind of night the entertainment industry exists to produce. The theater was enormous, a historic venue with a restored facade and a red carpet that stretched half a block. Camera crews were everywhere. Celebrities arrived in waves. The press gallery was 3 rows deep, and the flashbulbs were constant, a strobe of attention that turned every arrival into a moment, every gesture into an image. Damien Hale arrived at 8:45, 45 minutes after the carpet had opened. This was intentional. He had told his publicist, who was Celeste, who was on his arm as he stepped out of the car, that the timing needed to communicate ease, that arriving exactly on time communicated anxiety, that the people who commanded rooms were always the last to enter them. Celeste had agreed with everything. She agreed with everything now, had been agreeing with everything for 2 years, and Damien had come to find this essential, the way you find essential things you cannot imagine living without. He was wearing a black tuxedo that had been custom fitted and had cost $12,000, a cost that had been billed to the production's wardrobe account under the category of director's presentation costs. The camera crews surged when they saw him. Reporters called his name. He moved down the carpet with the particular gait of a man who has spent years learning how to make walking look effortless, one hand at the small of Celeste's back, his smile calibrated to suggest both warmth and distance simultaneously. Inside, 3,000 seats were occupied. Investors who had backed the film, executives from the studio's international partners, critics who had been flown in from 7 countries, celebrities whose attendance had been negotiated through their publicists at considerable cost, also billed to the production account, also in the audit file. The atmosphere had the particular charge of a major industry event, that combination of genuine excitement and performed excitement that makes it difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Damien took his seat in the center of the front row. Celeste sat beside him. He looked at the empty seat to his left, the seat that had been reserved, according to the event manifest, for the studio's majority owner, and he registered its emptiness with something close to satisfaction. He assumed Elara hadn't come. He assumed she was at home, or wherever diminished people went when they no longer had access to the world they'd briefly occupied. He turned to say something to Celeste, and she laughed, and he felt, in that moment, completely untouchable. The lights dimmed. The screen at the front of the theater, floor to ceiling, state-of-the-art, the kind of screen designed to make what appears on it feel inevitable, lit up with the studio logo. The crescent Damien crest. The audience applauded reflexively. Then the screen went to black. Damien leaned back in his seat and waited for his film to begin. What appeared instead was a single line of text. White letters on black background. It read, "Before we begin, the board of Northbridge Legacy Group would like to share a presentation." There was a confused murmur in the audience. Someone near the back said, "What is this?" Damien sat forward. He looked at the screen with the particular focused alertness of someone who has just felt the temperature in a room drop without knowing why. The first slide appeared. Production account 4471. B. The Ivory Throne. Fiscal year expenditure review. Then the numbers started. It began with the villas. Photographs. Actual photographs, sourced from the booking confirmations that had been subpoenaed through the financial investigation, of properties in the south of France and Tuscany and the Maldives. Dates, costs, the production account line items that had been used to pay for them, the names on the booking confirmations, Damien's name, and, repeatedly, the name of the shell company that traced back to Celeste. The audience went from confused to still in approximately 30 seconds. The second slide was the private jet logs. Departure cities, arrival cities, passenger manifests, costs, account codes. The discrepancy between any legitimate production purpose and the actual destinations. Ibiza, Monaco, a ski resort in Switzerland in February, a destination that corresponded with no production schedule on any document in the studio's records, was self-explanatory. The third slide was the jewelry receipt. A single item, $87,000. The item description, diamond bracelet, bespoke commission. The account it had been charged to. A photograph of the bracelet, which had appeared on Celeste's wrist in a magazine spread published the previous spring, a spread that Damien had arranged, that his publicist, Celeste, had pitched, that had run under a headline describing her as a rising power player in the industry. Someone in the audience stood up. Damien couldn't see who it was. He was staring at the screen with an expression that had stopped resembling anything recognizable. "Turn it off," he said. To no one. To everyone. "Turn this off." No one turned it off. The fourth slide was the mica veil documentation. The original submission receipt, enlarged to fill the entire screen. The date visible. The studio's intake stamp visible. Below it, side-by-side excerpts from Micah's original screenplay and the corresponding scenes from Damien's shooting script. The language was not similar. It was identical. Scene structures, character dynamics, specific dialogue, the particular arc of the third act that Damien had described in interview after interview as his most personal creative achievement. "That's not," Damien started. "Damien," the voice came from 2 rows behind him. Calm, clear, carrying in the silence of the theater the way a voice carries when a room has gone completely quiet. He turned. Elara was there. She was wearing ivory, deliberately, pointedly, the color of the film's title, which had been her idea and which he had never known was her idea, and she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a word for. It was not anger. It was not satisfaction. It was something older and more considered than either. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a moment to arrive and is now simply watching it arrive. He turned back to the screen. The fifth slide was the Victor Thorne connection, the shell company, the publication payments, the bank account, the board consulting fees processed through the same intermediary, the dates, the articles, the matching language. Victor, sitting 12 seats to Damien's right, made a sound that was not quite a word. The sixth slide was the security footage. Interior cameras from the production offices, capturing Damien at a workstation, files visible on the screen behind him. Timestamp in the corner. The footage was silent but unmistakable. Then the audio recording, the voice unmistakably Damien's, playing over the silent footage. Delete those files. The whole folder. I need it gone by morning. And then the other voice, the junior administrator, uncertain, afraid, but the backup systems, and then Damien, override them. I don't care how. The junior administrator had not overridden them. The files remained. They were in the evidence package that Rowan Mercer had filed with the relevant regulatory bodies at 9 o'clock that morning. The seventh slide was the financial summary. Total misappropriated funds. $4,317,000. Itemized. Sourced. Every figure traceable to a specific account and a specific transaction and a specific date. The eighth slide was 4 words and a name. Majority owner. Chairwoman. Controlling shareholder. Elara Hale. The silence in that theater lasted for a long time. Long enough to become something physical, a weight the audience was sitting underneath. Then it broke, not all at once, but in pieces, a murmur here, a sharp word there, the sound of chairs scraping, someone's phone screen illuminating in the dark. Damien had not moved. He was still facing the screen, which had now gone to the Northbridge Legacy Group logo, serene and permanent. Celeste stood up. She smoothed her coat. She looked at Damien and opened her mouth and then closed it again. Whatever she had planned to say in this moment, whatever vision she had built in her mind of what this premiere would represent for her, for them, for the future she had decided was hers to claim, it did not survive contact with what had just appeared on that screen. She walked out, quickly, but not quickly enough to not be seen walking out. Victor Thorne sat very still. He had the look of a man running calculations in real time, assessing exits, measuring distances, deciding which move was less catastrophic than the others. His phone was in his hand, though he hadn't done anything with it yet. He hadn't done anything at all. He simply sat there. Board members were already on their phones. 2 of them had stepped into the aisle. One of them was talking in a rapid undertone that, from where Elara sat, sounded like it contained the words board counsel, and immediately. Damien got up from his chair. He moved toward the aisle with the uncertain, slightly tilting movement of someone whose equilibrium has been knocked off center. He walked toward where Elara was sitting. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her in a way he had not looked at her in years. Not with contempt, not with the comfortable dismissiveness that had been his default for so long. He looked at her the way you look at something you realize you have fundamentally, irreversibly misread. Elara, he said. His voice was different, quieter. Something had left it. I need you to talk to me. We can figure this out. Whatever you think happened, we can. I don't think anything happened, she said. I know exactly what happened. All of it. Then let me explain. Damien. She looked at him without heat, without rancor, without any of the things he might have been preparing himself to absorb. You handed me divorce papers over my parents' graves. You stood in front of everyone who ever loved them, and you told me you had only stayed for their sake. She paused. What exactly is it that you'd like to explain? He didn't answer. There wasn't an answer. She stood. She was slightly taller than him in the heels she'd chosen for the evening, and she held herself with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time conserving their energy for a moment that has now arrived. You mistook my patience for dependence, she said. That was your only real mistake. Everything else was just consequence. She stepped past him. She walked up the aisle of that theater, past the board members still making calls, past the journalists who had already begun texting their editors with shaking fingers, past the investors and the executives and the celebrities who had come for a film premiere and were going to leave with something else entirely. She walked through the lobby, past the staff who stepped aside instinctively, and through the main doors and out into the night. Behind her, the building, which was hers, hummed with consequence. The walk to her car was exactly 37 steps. She had not counted them on the way in. She counted them on the way out, not from anxiety, but from the same methodical attention she brought to everything, the same quality of presence that her mother had always said was her greatest inheritance and her most reliable weapon. The car was waiting. Her driver, who had been with the family for 16 years and who, unlike almost everyone else in her professional world, had always known exactly who she was, held the door without a word. She got in. The door closed. The city slid past the windows. She did not cry. She did not feel the relief she had expected to feel. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complex, a kind of release that was not quite satisfaction, a kind of grief that was not quite loss. She thought about her parents. She thought about her father's hands, how large they had been, how steady, how she had held one of them in both of hers on the last night, and had felt it go still. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone the year before the diagnosis, calling to talk about something small, a book she'd read, a film she'd seen. The way her parents had always called to talk about small things because they understood that the small things were what accumulated into a life. She thought about Damien, not with anger, with something that was closer to mourning, not for who he had turned out to be, but for who she had spent years believing he might become. There had been a real person there once, a real mind, a real vision, a real quality of attention that had made her feel seen in the way she had always wanted to be seen. That part had not been invented. It had simply not been enough to survive the combined weight of his ambition and his ego and his fundamental unwillingness to examine either. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, moving, bright and different. She watched it for a while. Then she took out her phone and typed a message to Gideon. "Everything ready for tomorrow morning?" His reply came back in under a minute. "Everything is ready." She put the phone down. She leaned her head back against the seat. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to close her eyes without bracing for what might come next. By midnight, the legal process was already in motion. Rowan Mercer had filed the regulatory complaints that morning, as planned, and by the time the premiere audience was dispersing into the night, the relevant authorities had already received the full documentation package. The audit findings, the financial forensics, the communication records, the digital security logs, the mica veil submission evidence. The complaint was comprehensive, precisely because Rowan Mercer had spent 40 years of his professional life understanding that incomplete complaints give opposing counsel room to maneuver, and he was not a man who gave room. Damien's personal attorney received notification at 11:47 that evening. His financial manager received a separate communication shortly after midnight. By 1 in the morning, Damien was in his attorney's office. Not the office he had used for the divorce filing, a different one, a criminal defense specialist whose name had been passed to him by another industry figure who had, some years earlier, needed exactly this category of help. The attorney's name was not important. What was important was what he told Damien after reading through the documentation for 45 minutes in silence. He said, "This is significant. This is more than significant. I want you to understand what you're looking at." He set the papers down. The financial misappropriation alone carries meaningful exposure. The communications, the recorded call about deleting the files, that's the one that concerns me most. The screenplay issue is a separate civil matter, but it compounds the picture considerably. Damien said, "What do I do?" His attorney said, "Right now, nothing. You don't call anyone. You don't email anyone. You don't text anyone. Whatever you have been doing in the last 24 hours to communicate about this situation, you stop immediately. There are board members I need to talk to." "No," his attorney said. "There are no board members for you to talk to. As of tonight, you have no standing at that company. Zero. The controlling shareholder has made her position clear, and she holds 61% of the vote. You are a director whose production deal is under investigation. That is your entire position as of this moment." Damien was quiet for a long time. Then he said, with the particular disbelief of someone who cannot locate the mechanism by which events have arrived at their current position. She planned all of this. His attorney looked at him without particular sympathy. It appears that she did, he said. Victor Thorne's board seat was suspended pending investigation at 9 o'clock the following morning. The motion was brought by 3 other board members and passed with 7 votes in favor and 1 abstention. Victor, who had been attempting to reach institutional investors since the previous evening, found that the calls he was accustomed to having returned promptly were no longer being returned promptly. He retained an attorney. He issued a statement through that attorney describing the investigation as politically motivated and the suspension as procedurally improper, which is the language people use when they cannot yet afford to say anything more specific. The statement did not generate the industry sympathy he had expected. Celeste left the city. This became known because her absence from a scheduled appearance was noted, and then because someone at her management company, not a friend precisely, but someone who had always found her ambition more interesting than her character, mentioned to a journalist that she had gone to stay with family, without specifying where or for how long. Her social media, which had been a constant presence of curated photographs and industry commentary, went silent overnight. Her last post, still visible as of the morning after the premiere, was a photograph of the premiere carpet. She was in the foreground. Damien was slightly behind her, turned away from the camera. The caption was an industry hashtag and 3 celebratory emojis. No one engaged with the post the way they had engaged with her post before. Micah Vale arrived at Crescent Dominion Studios at 10 o'clock on the morning after the premiere. He had been told to come to the 14th floor, which was not the archives department and was not a junior meeting room. It was a proper executive office, the kind with a view, the kind that communicated through its proportions and its light that decisions made inside it were the kind that lasted. He sat across from Rowan Mercer and a member of the studio's in-house creative affairs team and 2 members of the legal department. And over the course of 2 hours, the terms of a new agreement were negotiated. The screenplay credit would be formally restored. The film, which was already completed and which had cost the studio $47 million to produce, would proceed to its distribution schedule with one significant modification. The credit block would reflect the actual origin of the material. Damien's name would not appear in the writing credits. He would not appear in the directing credits, which were, under the terms of the production agreement, and given the scope of what had been uncovered, now under formal review. The studio would provide legal support for any civil proceedings Micah chose to pursue against Damien personally. The studio would additionally offer Micah a development deal for his next 2 projects, with terms that were, Rowan noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been doing this for a long time, significantly above market. Micah Vale sat in that executive office, and he looked at the papers in front of him, and he pressed his hands flat on the table the same way he had in the small meeting room 2 weeks earlier. He was not crying this time. He was something else, something that did not have a clean name, the particular state of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they have forgotten what it feels like not to carry it, and are only now beginning to understand what that lightness might be. I just want to make something good, he said. That's all I've ever wanted. The woman from Creative Affairs smiled at him. Then you're in the right place, she said. He signed the papers. He walked out of the building into the morning, blinking slightly in the light, like someone stepping out of a long and difficult indoor space in a fresh air. Elara spent that morning in her parents' house. Not the family estate. That was larger, more formal, the house of a legacy rather than a home. But the smaller house where her parents had actually lived, the one where her mother had kept a garden that had gotten slightly wild in the last years, where her father had read every Saturday morning in the same chair until he no longer could, where the kitchen still smelled, inexplicably, of the specific tea her mother had imported from a small producer in Japan and had drunk every morning for 30 years. She walked through the rooms slowly. She was not in a hurry. There was nowhere she needed to be until afternoon. She sat in her father's chair. She looked out the window at the garden. She thought about the conversation she'd had with her mother 2 weeks before the first diagnosis, when Seraphine had called her on a Sunday evening and had said, with characteristic directness, I need to talk to you about the company. Not the structure. You know the structure. I need to talk about what it means. What it means, Elara had said. Responsibility, her mother said. Not the kind people talk about in boardrooms. The actual kind. The kind where you look at what you control and you understand that every decision you make about it is a decision about other people's lives. The people who work there. The artists who need what we provide. The ones who can't fight for themselves because they don't have the leverage. She paused. Your father and I built this company with that understanding. We want you to carry it. Elara had said, I know, Mom. I know you know, Seraphine said. I'm telling you anyway, because knowing something and carrying it are different. In the quiet of her father's chair, Elara thought about that distinction. Knowing and carrying. She had spent years knowing. She had spent the last 6 weeks carrying. She thought it would feel different, heavier, maybe, or more dramatic. Instead, it felt like this. Like a Sunday morning in a house where people you loved had lived. Like the particular quality of light through windows someone else had chosen. Falling on furniture someone else had arranged. In rooms that carried the traces of 40 years of a life lived with intention. She stayed for 2 hours. Then she drove to the office. The board meeting convened at 2 o'clock. 12 members, minus Victor, whose seat was suspended. Elara sat at the head of the table. At the head, where the chair she had not yet occupied formally waited for her, where the name placard read Chairwoman. And she looked around the room at 11 faces that wore, collectively, the expression of people adjusting to a reality that had arrived faster than they'd anticipated. She had prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She had notes, but she did not consult them. She knew what she wanted to say, and she said it in the order that made sense, without preamble, without apology, without the particular softening language that people sometimes use to make difficult things easier to hear. I want to begin by acknowledging, she said, that some of you have operated under assumptions about this company's governance structure that were reasonable given the information available to you. Those assumptions are now corrected. I will not spend time on that. What I want to spend time on is what we're going to do next. She laid out the plan. The investigation would continue through its regulatory process without any interference from the company. She was clear about this, and she watched each face as she said it to see who flinched and who didn't. The distribution plan for the Ivory Throne would proceed with revised credits and revised terms, because the film represented the work of hundreds of people who had nothing to do with what Damien had done and who deserved to see that work reach its audience. Victor's board seat would remain suspended pending the outcome of the investigation into the publication payments. Any board member who had information relevant to either investigation was expected to cooperate fully with the regulatory process, and the company's legal team would not be obstructing that process on behalf of anyone. Then she talked about the other thing, the thing that mattered more than any of the preceding items. My parents built this company on a specific understanding of what a media company can be, she said. Not just commercially dominant, actually meaningful. A place that finds the people who have something real to say and gives them the resources to say it. We have drifted from that. She looked around the table. We are going to drift back. She outlined the new creative initiative. A submission fund, real money, meaningful money, not a gesture, for emerging writers and directors. A fast-track development process for material that had been submitted through standard channels and overlooked. A dedicated team to review the backlog of years of submissions, starting with the most recent and working backward. She named Micah Vale as the first recipient of a new writer's development program and described what his deal contained. One of the board members, older, with the particular quality of someone who has been in rooms like this for many years and has developed an instinct for which way things are moving, said carefully, this is a significant shift in operational focus. Yes, Elara said. The financial commitment alone is sustainable, she said. I've run the numbers. Gideon has run the numbers. We can talk about the projections after this session if you'd like. He nodded. He didn't push back. She noted that. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it was over, she sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes after everyone had left. She looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She thought about what her mother had said, the difference between knowing and carrying. She was carrying it now. In the weeks that followed, Things happen with the particular velocity of institutional change when the person at the center of it knows what they want and has the authority to get it. The regulatory investigation into the financial fraud moved through its process with the efficiency that tends to accompany cases where the documentation is exceptionally clear. Damien's attorney was correct in his assessment that the recorded call about the file deletion was the most significant individual piece of evidence. It demonstrated not just the underlying fraud, but the awareness of wrongdoing and the attempt to conceal it, which are the components that transform financial misconduct into something more consequential. Damien was not imprisoned. This is not that kind of story, and also it is not how these things typically work in practice, where the distance between doing something illegal and experiencing the formal consequences of having done it is long and expensive and navigated largely by people whose fees run by the hour. What happened to Damien was perhaps less dramatic than imprisonment and in some ways more complete. His production deal was terminated. His producing credits on active projects were reviewed and in several cases removed or revised. His name was withdrawn from the Film Academy's consideration list for the current year's technical committees. He was not invited to things he had previously been invited to. He did not appear on magazine covers. The interviews dried up with the particular swiftness of things that dry up when they were never really about the person, but about the position the person occupied. He tried, in the early weeks, to mount a counter-narrative. His attorney gave a statement. He gave a statement. The statement described the regulatory process as premature and characterized certain evidence as taken out of context, which is the thing people say when the evidence is not actually capable of being understood differently in any context. The counter-narrative did not gain traction. This was partly because the evidence was very clear. It was also partly because the entertainment press, which had spent 2 years building a version of Damien Hale as a visionary, found a different story considerably more interesting. Celeste resurfaced eventually in a different city, in a different industry-adjacent role. She gave one interview, months later, in which she did not mention Damien by name and spoke in general terms about learning experiences and redirecting her ambitions. The interview was not widely read. She had been, it turned out, a person whose public presence had been almost entirely constructed from proximity to someone else's power, and when that proximity ended, there was not quite enough underneath it to sustain a public presence independently. Victor Thorne's situation resolved slowly and then conclusively. The investigation into the publication payments established the connection between the shell company and the board advisory account to the satisfaction of the regulatory body reviewing it. He resigned from the board before he could be formally removed, issuing a statement that characterized his resignation as a personal decision made in the best interests of the company, and that contained no acknowledgement of the investigation's findings. This is also how these things work in practice. The resignation was accepted. The board seat was not replaced immediately. Elara intended to fill it deliberately, which meant not filling it until the right person had been identified, and she was not in a hurry. She was not in a hurry about anything. This was new, or rather it was old. It was the quality she had always had, the one her mother had recognized and named before anyone else. But it had a different quality now, the patience of someone who has delivered on what they were waiting to deliver on, rather than the patience of someone who is still waiting. It was a subtly but meaningfully different thing. 5 months after the premiere, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, Elara walked into Crescent Dominion Studios through the main entrance. Not the side entrance she had used for years, the one closer to the archives, the one that delivered her into a corridor where she was just another person moving through a building rather than someone who owned it. The main entrance. 40 feet of glass and steel, and the Crescent Dominion crest rendered in backlit brushed gold above the reception desk, where 2 people sat who had been part of a welcome and security team she had quietly restructured in her first month. They looked up when she came in. They said good morning. She said good morning back. She crossed the atrium. She got into the elevator. She pressed the button for the 41st floor, the floor that contained the executive suite, the boardroom, and the chairwoman's office, the office that had been her father's and then formally hers since the trust activation, Though she had spent the first months governing from multiple locations, moving through the company as she always had, present everywhere and visible nowhere. That period was over. The elevator opened onto a corridor with a different quality of light than the floors below. That particular combination of deliberate architecture and genuine authority that her father had always said a company's top floor should communicate. She walked the length of the corridor. At the end was a set of double doors that she had passed many times over the years, always from the outside. Her assistant, new, chosen by Elara personally from an internal candidate pool that Elara had reviewed herself, opened the doors as she approached. Inside was the office, large, with the floor-to-ceiling windows she had seen from the boardroom, with a desk that had been her father's and that she had chosen not to replace because the replacement would have felt like a severance rather than a continuation. On the desk were 3 things she had placed there herself. A photograph of her parents taken on the day they had signed the documents that established Northbridge Legacy Group, a copy of Micah Vale's original screenplay submission, the one with the intake stamp, and a handwritten note in her father's handwriting from a card he had given her years ago, which read only, "You know what you are?" She sat down. She opened the laptop. She looked at the morning schedule. The first meeting was with Micah Vale and the creative development team to review the treatment he had submitted for his next project. The second was a call with international distribution partners about the revised release plan for The Ivory Throne, which had premiered, after all, not on the night Damien had planned for, but 3 weeks later, with its credits corrected and its production story publicly documented and its opening weekend performance exceeding every projection the studio had run. The third meeting was with a group of 23 emerging filmmakers who had been selected through the new submission review program, who were coming to the 41st floor for the first time, who did not yet know that the woman who would meet with them would remember each of their names, would have read each of their projects, would be genuinely curious about what they were trying to make. She had 15 minutes before the first meeting. She looked out the window. The city below was doing what it always did, moving, building, accumulating, indifferent to any individual story playing out within it. She watched it without needing it to acknowledge her. This was the thing Damien had never understood about her. She had never needed to be seen by the world. She had only ever needed to be doing the right thing within it. Her phone lit up. A message from Gideon. The Q3 financials are in. You should see the streaming numbers. She typed back, send them over. Then she thought for a moment and typed a second message. How does it look? His reply came back quickly, like someone who knows what they're doing. She set the phone down. She looked at her father's handwriting on the card. You know what you are. She did. She always had. She had simply been waiting, with the patience of someone who understands that timing is everything, for the world to catch up to what she already knew. When her assistant opened the door to tell her that the first meeting was ready, she stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the office toward it. The company was hers. It had always been hers. Now everyone knew it. If this story kept you watching until this final moment, then you already know what kind of storytelling this channel delivers. Stories where power is quiet before it's loud, where patience is the real weapon, where the person everyone underestimated was never actually the underdog. They were just waiting for the right moment to stop pretending. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest for you. Was it the funeral? The premiere? The moment Elara said, "You mistook my patience for dependence"? And if you're watching this and you know someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who held her ground and took back everything that was hers, share this video with them. We'll see you in the next one.